If this video has appeared before you right now, to explain it solely as a chain of suggestions or a mere coincidence would be a gross underestimate of what's happening. Because from a quantum consciousness perspective, time is not linear. It is a living field that bends, expands, and connects you with specific experiences at the exact moment you are ready, according to your level of awareness. The fact that you are reading these words right now indicates that your consciousness has reached a certain frequency threshold and that your old layers of perception are beginning to feel restrictive. The fifth dimension gateway is not a physical passage or a mystical space. It is the level of consciousness where perception deepens, where you realize that reality is not only an existing experience but also a chosen one. People who reach this point often say the same thing. Something in my life is strangely overlapping. In reality, what overlaps is not events, but the possibilities offered by the universe through your awareness. Because in the quantum field, no experience happens by chance. It only happens without being noticed. The concept of chosen here does not imply superiority or privilege. This word describes the fine line between the one who notices and the one who does not. Hundreds of people may pass by on the same street, but only one sees themselves reflected in the shop window. Consciousness is like that. Fifth-dimensional consciousness is potentially present for everyone, but not everyone can perceive that door at the same time. Because the door doesn't open from the outside, it's perceived from within. You've passed by many signs until now, ignoring some, dismissing others as mere coincidence. But from a quantum perspective, recurring signs indicate a strengthening of the synchronization between your consciousness and the field. As this synchronization increases, the perception of time changes, the concept of coincidence loses its meaning, and life ceases to be a chain of random events, transforming into a meaningful flow. The moment this door opens usually comes not with a great shock, but with a silent realization. You wake up one morning and find yourself in the same life, but not looking at it with the same eyes. Things that previously triggered you have lost their power. Some fears become meaningless, and some goals suddenly seem artificial. Because when consciousness begins to perceive a broader layer of reality, old patterns naturally dissolve. This dissolution is not a loss. On the contrary, it is the shedding of unnecessary burdens. The fifth dimension gateway appears precisely here, when the question, "Who am I?" gradually begins to be replaced by, "What am I aware of?" Life is no longer something that happens to you, but an experience that takes shape with you. The fact that this narrative is reaching you now indicates that your consciousness is resonating with a specific frequency. In the quantum realm, frequency is not just vibration, but choice. The more aware you are, the more conscious choices you make. The more conscious choices you make, the more flexible your reality becomes. That's why some people remain stuck in the same conditions, while others move forward as if passing through invisible gateways. What makes the difference is not chance, but observer consciousness. The moment you realize you are an observer, you cease to be a passive figure in the game. This awareness doesn't demand a belief system. It only requires honest introspection, because fifth-dimensional consciousness begins not where you say, "I believe," but where you say, "I am aware." And right now, with these sentences, you stand on the threshold of that gateway. The consciousness standing on this threshold no longer fits into the narrow molds of old timelines, because the labels, roles, and habits that defined you in the past are now beginning to dissolve in your field of perception. Many things you previously considered normal seem strange and artificial as awareness increases. This is not alienation. It is a process of consciousness aligning with a broader reality. In the quantum realm, every expansion initially creates a feeling of uncertainty. The mind thinks it has lost control, but what is happening is the dissolution of the illusion of control. Consciousness, approaching the gate of the fifth dimension, learns to read everything instead of trying to control everything, without forcing what is happening, without suppressing the flow, simply by observing. At this point, your relationship with time also begins to change. The past ceases to be a heavy burden that defines you. The future moves away from being an unknown that generates anxiety. Because in quantum consciousness, only now exists, And now is the intersection of all possibilities. Have you ever carefully observed recurring scenes in your life? Different people, different places, different times, but the same emotional outcomes, the same disappointment, the same feeling of delay, the same question of, why did this happen again? From a quantum consciousness perspective, this is not bad luck or fate. It is a conscious pattern called the observer loop. The observer loop is when consciousness unconsciously emits the same frequency signature and repeatedly experiences the probabilities corresponding to that signature. So events seem to change, but as long as your inner state doesn't change, the outcome remains the same. This cycle begins not in the external world, but at the center of perception. Because in the quantum field, what determines reality is not the events themselves, but the stance of the consciousness observing them. Most people think they are living life, but often they are only repeating habitual reactions. The same thoughts, the same defenses, the same expectations. The mind considers the familiar safe and perceives the unknown as a threat. That's why the observer loop goes unnoticed for a long time. The person thinks they have changed, but only the scenery has changed. Just like a jukebox that constantly plays the same record. The needle is stuck in the same place. The melody is familiar. And after a while, it turns into background noise. It is at this stage that a slight unease begins in consciousness. A feeling of, there must be more, emerges. This unease is not a problem, but a sign that the cycle is beginning to crack. Because consciousness no longer wants to remain at the same frequency. The most critical characteristic of the observer cycle is this. While a person thinks of themselves as a victim, they are actually an active producer. In the quantum field, the observer is not passive. They influence, shape, and sustain what they observe. However, this influence is often unconscious. When a person says, "These things are happening to me," they are actually unconsciously sending the message, "I am in harmony with this experience." This message does not contain blame. There is only a match. For consciousness approaching the fifth dimension, this is the most difficult but most liberating awareness. The cycles you are experiencing are not your fault, but they are related to you. When this awareness comes, power, not guilt, is born, because you no longer need to wait for external conditions for change. When the observer's position changes, the cycle begins to unravel spontaneously. The breaking point emerges precisely here. This point does not have to be a dramatic event. Sometimes a single sentence, sometimes a silent inner realization, sometimes an inexplicable feeling of fulfillment is enough. You no longer defend the same thought as strongly as before. You are no longer as certain of the same reaction. Consciousness begins to shift from autopilot to manual mode. A feeling of uncertainty can arise during this transition because the mind thinks it has lost control. However, what is lost is not control, but the illusion of control. Fifth-dimensional consciousness doesn't try to manage everything. It learns to read everything. When you can look at what's happening from a broader perspective, you begin to clearly see where the cycle begins and how it holds you captive. Along with this awareness, the perception of time also changes. The same event no longer drags you along as much. The same trigger no longer creates the same effect, because the observer's position has shifted. In the quantum field, a small change in observation transforms large chains of probability. That's why some people say, "My luck has suddenly changed," while others describe it as, "My life has silently changed." In reality, what changes is not luck, but frequency. When the observer cycle is broken, consciousness aligns with a new timeline. This new line is calmer, clearer, and less resistant. Because you no longer have to repeat the same experience. The cycle doesn't hold you. You've seen the cycle, and something seen can no longer reign in consciousness as it once did. At this stage, consciousness begins to ask itself, what am I really observing? Or am I just repeating a familiar interpretation? This question is a critical threshold in breaking the cycle. Because most people observe not the events themselves, but their old meanings. The same situation, the same person, the same sentence, but each time consciousness automatically produces the same interpretation. From a quantum perspective, This is the repetition of perception, not reality. The observer cycle locks precisely here. Fifth-dimensional consciousness, however, learns to suspend interpretation. To see what is, without labeling it, without comparing it to past experiences, simply as it is. This simple but profound perspective initiates the first real movement that breaks consciousness out of the cycle. Every thought is a vibration, every emotion a signal, and every intention a conscious or unconscious trace left in the quantum field. The sum of these traces constitutes your frequency signature. Most people think of frequency as an abstraction, whereas frequency is directly linked to how you view life, how you interpret events, and how you talk to yourself. From a quantum consciousness perspective, the universe reflects to you not what you want, but what you are. That's why some people expand under the same conditions, while others get stuck, because probabilities are not equal. Only those that are in harmony with the current frequency become visible. This is where fifth-dimensional consciousness comes in. When you realize that choices are not just external decisions, but internal vibrations. The concept of probability is often misunderstood. People perceive probability as something that will happen in the future, whereas in the quantum field, probabilities exist in the present moment. They all exist simultaneously, but they are not all experienced at the same time. Consciousness is like a radio receiver. You only hear the broadcast you are tuned to. That's why what you call luck is often an adjustment you make unconsciously. When you shift your frequency, the options life offers you silently change as well. Doors you couldn't see before become visible. Paths you once thought possible become meaningless. This isn't a miracle, it's an expansion of perception. Fifth-dimensional consciousness doesn't create possibilities. It becomes able to perceive those that already exist. This is precisely where choice is redefined. Most people think of choice as a difficult decision between two options. However, in quantum consciousness, choice is a series of micro-adjustments made every moment. What you focus on, what you take seriously, what you repeatedly dwell on in your mind. Each of these is a choice, and these choices determine which possibilities will be strengthened. That's why two people making the same decision can experience completely different outcomes. Because even if the decision is the same, the conscious mindset is different. The fifth-dimensional gateway opens to something beyond the belief that, if I make the right decision, everything will be all right. The real question there is, from what level of consciousness am I making this decision? As the frequency increases, choices become clearer. The mind produces less noise, the body resists less. At this stage, people usually realize, life isn't as complicated as it used to be. It's just that I was looking at it in a complicated way. This realization reduces the need for control. Because consciousness no longer tries to force every possibility. It begins to sense which possibility is compatible. This feeling is not the opposite of logic. It is logic beginning to work in a broader context. In quantum consciousness, intuition is not a random instinct, but the ability to read frequencies. The more you remain silent, the clearer the field speaks. At this point, it is necessary to stop and honestly examine yourself. What possibilities are repeating themselves in your life? What experiences keep finding you? Examining these not by asking, why is this happening to me? But by asking, what frequency am I on? Creates a significant shift in consciousness. This shift is the practical equivalent of fifth-dimensional consciousness. There is no need for grand rituals, dramatic decisions, or sudden breaks. The real transformation begins with a change in inner alignment. If this description resonates with you right now, you can consciously choose to align with this frequency. To do this, simply write, "I am aligned with my highest timeline," in the comments below. This is not a wish. It is a declaration of choice that clarifies the direction of your current consciousness. Frequency, possibility, and choice are not separate concepts. They are different facets of the same process. When you change your frequency, the possibilities you perceive change. When the possibilities change, your choices become less challenging. The fifth dimension gateway opens precisely in this flow. There is no coercion, no escape, only clarity. And clarity is the most powerful state of consciousness. Here, life doesn't drag you along. You silently choose which possibility of life you will experience. At this level of consciousness, a person stops carrying past decisions with regret or pride, because they now see that every choice is a natural consequence of their current level of awareness. Both self-blame and self-glorification lose their meaning. In quantum consciousness, what matters is what your current frequency is. The past is not a list of mistakes to be changed. It is a map showing which frequencies it has passed through. Consciousness that can honestly look at this map does not have to repeat the same paths. This is why fifth-dimensional consciousness, by making peace with the past, stops trying to force the future. Because the real choice is always made in the awareness of the moment you are in. The fifth dimension is often misunderstood. People interpret it as detachment from the world, escape from suffering, or denial of reality. This level of consciousness is not an escape, but rather a deeper connection to the center of life. Fifth-dimensional consciousness does not ignore what is happening. It reads it from a broader perspective. Problems do not disappear, but the relationship with problems changes fundamentally. Events no longer define you. Emotions no longer control you. Thoughts no longer drag you along, because consciousness begins to observe what is happening not from within, but from a higher vantage point. This observation is not cold or distant. It is calm, clear, and inclusive. In this process of deepening, one ceases to see life as a constantly problem area that needs fixing. Because the fifth-dimensional perception realizes that every experience carries a message. Even suffering does not lose its meaning. It only changes direction. Difficulties cease to be punishing forces and become feedback that expands consciousness. At this point, an inner relief begins. Life still flows, but there is no longer a constant feeling of struggle, because consciousness has given up the effort to control everything. As the need for control diminishes, resistance dissolves. As resistance dissolves, experience deepens. The fifth dimension manifests itself precisely within this chain. At this level of consciousness, the relationship with time also fundamentally changes. The future ceases to be a goal to be reached. The past ceases to be a burden to be carried. People begin to perceive time not as a pressure element, but as a natural component of the flow. Some moments intensify, some periods accelerate, some waiting gains meaning, because consciousness no longer forces time. Consciousness that doesn't force time reads the information within the moment more clearly. This reading isn't a conflict between intuition and logic. It's the beginning of their working together in the same direction. Fifth-dimensional consciousness directs life towards feeling, not predicting. As the depth increases, people connect more clearly with their inner voice. This voice doesn't shout, direct, or demand. It only points. Questions that once caused indecision transform into calm clarity at this stage. Instead of thinking about what you should do, you become aware of what you shouldn't do. Because fifth-dimensional consciousness works by resolving excesses. Life may not become simpler, but consciousness does. This simplicity brings a powerful clarity. At this point, one often feels, I can no longer dedicate as much energy to certain things as before. This isn't a loss. It's the consciousness no longer clinging to discordant frequencies. This state of deepening also manifests in relationships. People seem to have changed, but what has changed is how you perceive them. Some dynamics that previously drew you in lose their effect, and some connections you didn't notice before gain meaning, because consciousness now acts in harmony, not habit. Fifth-dimensional consciousness doesn't try to keep everyone close. It doesn't push anyone away. It doesn't force anyone to come. If there is harmony, it stays. If not, it dissolves. This dissolution doesn't create drama. It happens silently and naturally. Because the deepening consciousness recognizes the frequency of coercion and stays away from it. In the end, one realizes, the fifth dimension is not a level to be reached, but a stance to be remembered. In this stance, life becomes not just more meaningful, but more honest. Masks fall, expectations simplify, and inner noise diminishes. Life no longer has to prove anything to you. Nor do you feel the need to prove yourself to life. This is where depth emerges. Because depth is not intense emotions. It is a clear awareness. The fifth dimension gate silently opens right here, before the consciousness that can remain without fleeing. As this depth increases, the relationship one has with oneself transforms. Inner dialogue softens. Harsh judgments lose their effect. The harsh words you previously used against yourself lose their meaning. Because consciousness no longer sees itself as a flaw to be corrected, but as a process to be read. Fifth-dimensional consciousness does not suppress inner conflicts. It encompasses them with a broader understanding. This encompassing state allows one to make peace with oneself. When one is at peace with oneself, there is no reason left to wage war with the outside world. Life remains the same, but you begin to exist within life with less tension. Another result of deepening is the new relationship established with silence. This silence is not emptiness, it is filled with knowledge. When the mind is silent, the space speaks. Signs you hadn't noticed before. Small details. Subtle feelings become visible. Therefore, fifth-dimensional consciousness manifests itself not through dramatic experiences, but through the meaning within ordinary moments. The inner awareness you are experiencing right now is not merely an individual process. Fifth-dimensional consciousness, while seemingly awakening in individual minds, is actually part of a collective wave. Like a rising current in the ocean, this movement of consciousness draws in those who are sensitive to certain frequencies. Everyone lives in the same world, but not everyone vibrates at the same frequency. Therefore, some people feel an inexplicable inner acceleration in recent years, while others feel a profound pause. This is not a separation, but an alignment. The collective wave leaves no one out. It only calls to those who are ready. Your contact with this narrative shows that this call has reached you as well. Collective consciousness is often misunderstood. People associate it with crowds, ideologies, or shared beliefs. However, from a quantum perspective, the collective field is more than the sum of individual consciousnesses. It is a living system formed by the overlapping of intentions, awarenesses, and observer positions. When you change your own frequency, the entire field is affected in a small but significant way. Therefore, although fifth-dimensional consciousness seems like a process that begins for yourself, its effect is never limited to you alone. A quiet clarity spreads around you imperceptibly. People may ask why you seem calmer, why you're not as reactive as before. You don't have to answer, because this transformation is felt more than explained. Everyone has a place within this collective wave. But this place isn't a fixed role. Some become pioneers, some balancers, some simply witnesses. Fifth-dimensional consciousness renders the question of, "What should I be?" meaningless, because consciousness already knows its natural position. When you don't force it, when you don't try to prove yourself, the field spontaneously places you where you should be. That's why some paths never open, while some doors silently ajar at unexpected moments. These aren't coincidences. These are the natural results of the harmony established with the collective field. This harmony strengthens not when you accelerate, but when you become clearer. One of the most noticeable effects of this wave is the dissolution of old bonds. Some relationships lose their meaning. Some conversations begin to feel superficial. This isn't a cooling off, it's a difference in frequency. As the collective wave rises, consciousness can no longer connect solely through habit. Energy cannot hold where there is no harmony. These dissolutions are often not dramatic. It is silent. One day, you realize that an environment that once exhausted you no longer calls to you. This lack of calling doesn't create a void. On the contrary, it leaves an inner peace, because consciousness now feels its place more clearly. Being in the collective wave doesn't mean belonging to a group. It's not necessary to speak the same language, use the same symbols, or repeat the same sentences. The real connection is beyond words. People standing at the same level of awareness share a similar silence, even if they don't know each other. This silence is not passive. It is full of attention. Fifth-dimensional consciousness clearly manifests itself at this point. It's no longer necessary to constantly explain, persuade, or defend. A stance of consciousness is enough. And this stance resonates in the collective field. If you realize that these contents make you feel you are not alone, it means you are already in contact with this wave. To nourish this awareness and stay on this frequency, subscribing to this channel is not a necessity. It can be a choice of harmony, because the collective wave is strengthened by voluntary connections, not by force. As you clarify your place, the field responds to you more clearly, and these answers come not with noise, but with a deep inner feeling of yes. Consciousness, progressing within this wave, no longer feels alone, yet it also doesn't feel the need to be in crowds, because collective harmony arises not from physical proximity, but from frequency resonance. People who don't live in the same city, or even don't know each other at all, can experience similar realizations simultaneously. They ask the same questions, notice similar thresholds. This synchronization points to the existence of a field of consciousness operating beyond individual minds. Fifth-dimensional consciousness softens the distinction between I and we at this point. A person remains both themselves and feels like they are part of a larger whole. This collective field doesn't direct, it doesn't impose. Its language is not command, but echo. The clearer you become, the clearer the feedback the field offers you. This feedback sometimes manifests as an encounter, sometimes as an unexpected idea, and sometimes as an inexplicable inner peace. Even if there seem to be no major changes in the outside world, a small shift in consciousness transforms the entire experience. At this point, there's no need for grand explanations, complex concepts, or new definitions. Because understanding that the door is open is a much quieter realization than forcing it open. Fifth-dimensional consciousness isn't about reaching a goal or advancing to a higher level. It's the courage to look at the reality you're already in from a different perspective. The door doesn't open somewhere outside. That door is already open the moment you become aware of it. That inner calling you felt for so long but couldn't name belongs precisely here, because consciousness doesn't take a new step when it's not ready. And when it is ready, it doesn't need persuasion to take that step. At this stage, one usually realizes that the old questions are no longer as powerful. Why did this happen? Is replaced by, what does this show me? This change seems small, but it radically alters the direction of consciousness. Life begins to be perceived not as being against you, but as a process moving alongside you. Difficulties don't disappear, but they lose their meaning. Because consciousness begins to see that everything that happens arises to expand itself. This perspective is not surrender. It is profound clarity. Consciousness that surrenders gives up, while consciousness that clarifies takes on responsibility with calm strength. The door being open doesn't mean everyone will pass through at the same time, because each consciousness moves according to its own timeline. Some become aware of this threshold but haven't yet taken the step. Others have already entered without realizing they've taken the step. Fifth-dimensional consciousness doesn't judge these differences, because consciousness becomes free when it transcends the need for comparison. It's no longer concerned with where others are, but with where you stand. This stance doesn't force you to rush. On the contrary, it makes you feel that everything is progressing at the pace it should. Fifth-dimensional consciousness is about ceasing to ask, what will happen next, and remaining within the question, what is happening now? Often, the step is to no longer cling to a thought as much as before. Sometimes it's not reacting, sometimes it's remaining silent, and sometimes it's accepting to say, I don't know. Fifth-dimensional consciousness deepens through small but clear choices, because consciousness expands not through dramatic moves, but through consistency. As you become aware of the frequency you are on at each moment, the steps align themselves automatically, and finally, one understands, the door was never closed. What was closed was the perspective that would perceive it. Now that perspective is present within you. This doesn't make you special, but it makes you responsible, because the conscious mind that perceives can no longer ignore. This is not a burden. It is a slight awakening. Life may not be easier from now on, but it will be more honest. Less noisy, less demanding, less defensive. The door is open. The signs are clear. Whether to step in or not is up to you. And this freedom is the clearest point that consciousness can reach. At this stage, consciousness no longer seeks definitive answers, because the search for answers often stems from the mind's need for control. Fifth-dimensional consciousness, however, is directed not towards control, but towards alignment. When aligned, you realize that the answers are already hidden within the questions. Therefore, some uncertainties don't bother you. Some gaps bring peace. There is no need for all parts of life to be clarified. Consciousness becomes able to sense wholeness even in places that seem incomplete. This intuition is like a silent affirmation that comes before taking the step. Consciousness, realizing the door is open, no longer turns back and tries to force open old doors. It doesn't bargain with past possibilities, nor does it cling to opportunities it thought were missed, because instead of fighting the timeline, it has learned to align with it. This alignment doesn't make one passive. On the contrary, it makes one more determined. You know what you want, not by shouting, but by feeling what you are in harmony with, and this feeling becomes the most reliable compass guiding you. You no longer need to prove your way. Just being on the path is enough. If this video left you with a sense of clarity, calmness, or an indescribable feeling of completeness, you can subscribe to this channel to stay on this frequency. This is not a call to follow, but an invitation to harmony. We also ask that you write, "The door is open, the step is mine," in the comments below. Write this for yourself, not for others, because when consciousness clarifies its intention, the field responds with the same clarity.